Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. Lolita, the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. She was low, playing low in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in 1 sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms, she was always Lolita. Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. It's been 6 months since I recorded my last video, so I feel a little awkward, but I'm really happy to be back. For those who have not read Lolita and are here out of curiosity, this novel is about a middle-aged pedophile called Humbert who kidnaps a 12-year-old girl and keeps her captive for a year. For a long time, I was curious about Lolita. I had watched the 1997 movie and I liked it, but my interest in this novel comes mostly from what people on the internet has to say about it. You can do a quick search on Reddit or Goodreads to see what people think about Lolita. Many who have not even read the novel condemn the story and call it immoral. Others who have read the book either interpret the story as a love story or assume that Nabokov was a pedophile who wrote Lolita to elicit sympathy towards pedophiles. So I decided to finally read the novel and develop my own opinions. In this video, I'll discuss how Lolita's readers' reactions have changed over time and the problem of making assumptions about authorial intention. First of all, I read the novel recently and I absolutely love it. I've never read a story so beautiful and disturbing. I understand why the story causes such visceral reactions because it is about a heavy subject. I also understand why people might feel triggered by this story. We all have our triggers, and it's okay to refuse to read a book, watch a movie, or avoid certain genres because they make you feel bad. This might sound ridiculous, but my particular trigger is dystopian fiction. Coming from Venezuela, I can't deal with fiction that shows government oppression. It makes me super anxious. Now, you will never hear me say that dystopian fiction is bad or immoral and it deserves to be banned just because I don't like it. What I mean to say is that I believe that much of the criticism about Lolita comes from outside the text, from society's and readers' experience rather than from the novel itself and what it has to say. So throughout this video, I will react to and comment on common critiques, questions, and assumptions that this novel often receives. So the first assumption that I see very often is that Nabokov was a closeted pedophile because Humbert's characterization feels very real. I think this is a very tragic assumption about the author because Nabokov's biographers agree that his uncle molested him when he was a child. So the reason why Nabokov's depiction of a pedophile is so accurate is that he was a victim of child sexual abuse. He also did a lot of research when he was writing this novel, so he would read a lot of psychology books regarding the themes he was writing about. This answer leads us to the following question. Then why did Nabokov portray Humbert as a sympathetic character? I don't understand why people see Humbert as a sympathetic character. I saw nothing sympathetic about him. He is not one of those villains who are vicious but charming, and you can't help but feel attracted to them. Humbert is a very pathetic man, and on top of that, he is a snob to the point of being condescending to the reader. But he is not a snob like Hannibal Lecter or Lestat. They can be snobs because they are very talented individuals. Humbert is just pathetic and he believes he is better than anyone else. He is also a narcissistic sociopath because throughout the story he is unable to establish meaningful connections with people around him. And he constantly disregards and mocks all the characters in the story. He is abusive to his wife, he plots terrible things, and he constantly fantasizes about murdering people who stand in his way. But again, he's not even a charming sociopath, he's just pathetic. I think this idea of Humbert as a sympathetic character comes from the earlier reactions to the novel and adaptations, not from the fact that Humbert is an actual sympathetic character. Here's what Nabokov has to say about it. Humbert is a vain and cruel wretch who only manages to appear touching. And I agree with him. There's nothing appealing or relatable about Humbert besides the fact that he's a well-written character. But so is Dolores, because Nabokov knows how to make his characters feel very real. Jamie Loftus, the host of the Lolita podcast, which I highly recommend, argues throughout the episodes that this perception of Humbert as touching or sympathetic does not originate with Humbert as a character. It comes from society, from the glorification of pedophiles and the sexualization of young girls. And I will add to it the normalization of age gaps in relationships between teenage girls and older men. I need to open a parenthesis here. I have nothing against age gaps as long as both parties are going through similar life stages. As a 32-year-old woman, I think we should never infantilize women when they are mature enough to make their own decisions about their bodies. For example, a 30-year-old woman dating a 45-year-old man is not the same as a 16-year-old girl dating a 27-year-old guy. Because while the older couple might be going through a similar life stage, the younger couple is going through completely different life stages. Just ask yourself, what would a 27-year-old man have in common with a 16-year-old girl? In the novel, Dolores is 12 years old. And Humbert is 37 years old. In the feminine Mystique, Friedan explains that in the 50s and 60s, it was common for young women, many of them teenagers, to marry older men because this union will ensure them a life of security. Most of these women were groomed by a culture of commodity into thinking that this was what women were supposed to do: get married quickly, have children, and become exceptional housewives. And many of them ended up trapped in unfulfilling lives. For his part, a man looks for a child housewife because he wants to be the center of her world. Friedan refers to this dynamic as the sexual solipsism of Sigmund Freud, and this dynamic permeated American society. Friedan explains that American girls began getting married in high school, and the women's magazines, deploring the unhappy statistics about these young marriages, urged that courses on marriage and marriage counselors be installed in the high schools. Girls started going steady at 12 and 13 in junior high. Lolita takes place between 1947 and 1952, and you see some of this when Dolores attends Beardsley School for Girls. This school is dedicated to teaching young girls how to become wives, not to encourage their academic pursuits. When Humbert meets with the head mistress, she explains, "We are not so much concerned, Mr. Humbert, with having our students become bookworms or be able to reel off all the capitals of Europe which nobody knows anyway, or learn by heart the dates of forgotten battles. What we are concerned with is the adjustment of the child to group life. This is why we stress the 4 Ds: dramatics, dance, debating, and dating. We are confronted by certain facts. Your delightful Dolly will presently enter an age group where dates, dating, date dress, date book, date etiquette mean as much to her as, say, business, business connections, business success mean to you." The novel also highlights the problematic age gaps between young girls and men. Throughout the story, Humbert tries to justify his actions using different arguments. At one point, he states, "I found myself maturing amid a civilization which allows a man of 25 to court a girl of 16, but not a girl of 12. Nabokov is very clever in including this argument because it can work the other way around. Indeed, there's not much difference between a 16-year-old girl and a 12-year-old girl. So how can 16 be the consenting age in many places? Why does society allow older men to prey on young girls this way? What's more, the fact that 16 is the consenting age in many places does not mean that 16-year-old girls are available and willing to be with any man. They still need to consent. Therefore, it is quite creepy to see the reactions of people in the entertainment industry, including book critics, who, after reading the novel, saw Lolita as a love story. Even Vanity Fair called the novel the only convincing love story of our century. This quote is included in the back cover of my edition. You can see it here. Let me clarify something. There's absolutely nothing romantic about this story. I don't want to sound condescending, but I don't know how a person who claims to possess critical thinking can call this novel a love story. Humbert is not in love with Dolores. Whenever he doesn't fetishize her childish behavior, he is disgusted by it. He says, "Mentally, I found her to be a disgustingly conventional little girl. Sweet hot jazz, square dancing, gooey fudge sundaes, musicals, movie magazines, and so forth. These were the obvious items in her list of beloved things." He never sees her as a subject, but as an object. He also doesn't care about her inner world, and he knows it. And it struck me that I simply did not know a thing about my darling's mind, and that quite possibly, behind the awful juvenile cliches, there was in her a garden, a twilight, and a palace gate. And why would he be interested in her thoughts? He is 37 and she's 12. At the end of the story, Humbert claims to be in love with Dolores, although at this point she's grown, married, and pregnant. Humbert says he loves her even when her childish beauty has faded and recognizes that he has ruined her life. Rhetorically speaking, there are two problems here. First of all, although she is 17 at this time, she is no longer a child because of her status as a wife, a mother, and because all the abuse she experienced has forced her to grow up too fast. Since she is technically an adult, Humbert can no longer continue his abuse and control her. This allows him some psychological distance to reflect on his past actions. Secondly, at this point in the narrative, Humbert has proven himself to be such an unreliable narrator that you can't tell if he's being genuine. He says that he loves her, but then confesses how there were times when he was ready to repent. But suddenly, loss will swell again, and "Oh no," Lolita will say with a sigh to heaven. And the next moment, the tenderness and the azure all will be shattered. In other words, he has moments of recognition when he has the chance to stop his abuse, but he won't because he only cares about his own pleasure. He knows he's hurting her, but he either ignores when she cries or takes advantage of her vulnerability. Even if Humbert is sincere, I don't think people should interpret this novel as a love story only because of this scene. That will be to disregard all the abuse Dolores goes through. Then why does Nabokov make Humbert the hero of the story? Humbert is not a hero, he is the protagonist of the story. The terms hero and protagonist are not interchangeable. The hero of a story is someone who possesses heroic qualities. He is usually a moral person. A protagonist is the character on whom the story centers. In the case of Lolita, both Dolores and Humbert are protagonists. To me, Humbert is clearly the villain and Dolores is the heroine. Humbert schemes like a villain and fantasizes rather disturbing things. He abuses his wives, he wants to kill people to get what he wants, and at some point, he even thinks that once Lolita stops being a child and her appeal to him fades away, he will get her pregnant so that she would have a daughter that he can turn into another sexual slave. As I mentioned before, absolutely nothing makes this man sympathetic. In contrast, I found myself rooting for Dolores and wanting her to hurt Humbert at any possible chance. I wanted her to escape and be happy. The story made me want to discover who Dolores was behind Lolita's persona. What about the prose? Humbert persuades and manipulates the readers to root for him. Yes and no. Humbert is our narrator, but he is also guilty of murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping a child. He is supposed to be persuasive. This is also a framed narrative. The story begins with a foreword written by an editor, a friend of Humbert's lawyer. He says that this is the confession of a murderer trying to elicit the sympathy of his readers and jurors. Under these circumstances, if Humbert didn't try to manipulate us into sympathizing with him, he would not be a convincing character. This is just how good writing works. The novel's foreword is very important, but unfortunately not many people seem to pay attention to it. To me, the editor character works as a surrogate for Nabokov. A look at what he has to say. I have no intention to glorify Humbert. No doubt, he is horrible. He is abject. He is a shining example of moral leprosy, a mixture of ferocity and jocularity that betrays supreme misery perhaps, but is not conducive to attractiveness. He is not a gentleman, but how magically his singing violin can conjure up a tendresse, a compassion for Lolita that makes us entranced with the book while abhorring its author. As you can see, Nabokov is telling his readers why he crafted the story the way that he did. He wants to show how sexual predators operate and also elicit compassion for their victims. The editor continues, as a case history, Lolita will become, no doubt, a classic in psychiatric circles. As a work of art, it transcends its expiatory aspects, and still more important to us than scientific significance and literary worth is the ethical impact the book should have on the serious reader. For in this poignant personal study, there lurks a general lesson. The wayward child, the egotistic mother, the panting maniac. These are not only vivid characters in a unique story. They warn us of dangerous trends. They point out patent evils. Lolita should make all of us, parents, social workers, educators, apply ourselves with still greater vigilance and vision to the task of bringing up a better generation in a safer world. Nabokov would hate me for saying this because he didn't like didacticism, but this story can be read as a cautionary tale for society. He wrote Lolita at a time when people would not talk about child sexual abuse. And whenever they did, the topic revolved around stranger danger situations. Nabokov is saying that we cannot solve a problem without first acknowledging there is a problem, and that people who often prey on children are not strangers but those who are closer to them. He wants us to know that it is society's duty to raise awareness and keep their eyes open for sexual predators. What makes Nabokov such an extraordinary writer is that despite making Humbert a persuasive character, Humbert's rhetoric is terrible and he comes across as unauthentic. He thinks he's charismatic, but he's not. He thinks he's smarter than the reader, but he's not. He constantly says things like, poor Humbert who has never slept with underage girls, or poor me who is being seduced by a child. I mean, how can you fall for that? I think there are two types of Lolita readers, the complicit reader and the naive reader. In her podcast, Jamie Loftus explains that most people who have adapted Lolita to the theater and cinema have been powerful white men like Stanley Kubrick and Adrian Lyne. It is no secret that men in the entertainment industry have always sexualized young girls and have treated female bodies like commodities. So it is no surprise that they will feel related to Humbert, interpret the novel as a love story, and portray it as such. By romanticizing the subject matter, they also encourage the audience to do the same. This is the complicit reader, people who are problematic in real life, so they will see nothing wrong in what Humbert is doing. In contrast, Humbert slowly seduces the naive reader. This could be someone too young to understand the novel, perhaps not an avid reader, or someone who's reading casually or merely trying to enjoy it without dissecting its real meaning. The naive reader is not necessarily problematic. For example, sometimes we just want to read without having to analyze every single sentence, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, I will call myself a naive Lolita viewer. When I was a teenager, I watched the Adrian Lyne adaptation of the novel. I remember being very confused because although the relationship between Dolores and Humbert is messed up, the movie made me think that she seduced him. And the film never questions Humbert's reliability as a narrator, but rather accepts that everything he says is true. So there you have it. I was too young to understand that minors cannot consent because they are unaware of what they're doing. I didn't know they seduced me is one of the arguments sexual predators use to justify their actions. I also think that the readers who judge Nabokov for this novel fall into the category of naive readers. Although they don't side with Humbert, they're not able to see past Humbert's terrible rhetoric to understand the author's intentions. To a certain extent, Humbert has been able to manipulate them into thinking that he is supposed to be the hero of the story and that they are supposed to side with him. Lolita is one of those novels you cannot simply see it and enjoy, at least not the first time you read it. You have to keep your eyes open and see the red flags. You have to learn to separate the real Humbert from the way Humbert is trying to portray himself. At the same time, you have to separate Lolita, an invention of Humbert, from Dolores, the actual character. This is a very challenging novel. In his book, A Reader's Guide to Nabokov's Lolita, Julian W. Connolly enumerates the methods Humbert uses to manipulate the reader. For instance, Humbert uses humor to connect with the reader. He mocks aspects of the American culture that his readers might find flawed as well, and he turns his humor back on himself in a self-deprecating and self-castigating manner. Connolly argues that these lessons the readers need to chastise Humbert. At the same time, Humbert puts himself in a vulnerable position, so his readers end up sympathizing with him. Another strategy that Humbert uses is that he presents himself as a misunderstood romantic seeker, not a common pedophile. Instead of calling himself a pedophile, he uses the word nympholet. Connolly points out that the word nympholet seems more elevated and poetic than the harsher and more common pedophile. By doing this, Humbert sets himself apart from other pedophiles. Unlike ordinary pedophiles who feel attracted to any children, Humbert possesses artistic sensibilities. He doesn't like any type of girl, he likes nymphets. And according to Humbert, not every pretty girl is a nymphet. He says, "You have to be an artist and a madman, a creature of infinite melancholy, with a bubble of hot poison in your loins and a super voluptuous flame permanently aglow in your subtle spine, in order to discern at once by ineffable signs the slightly feline outline of a cheekbone, the slenderness of a limb, and other indices which despair and shame and tears of tenderness forbid me to tabulate. The little deadly demon among the wholesome children, she stands unrecognized by them and unconscious herself of her fantastic power." In other words, nymphets are girls whom Humbert perceives as possessing sensuality. What is significant about this quote is that he describes his attraction as not the result of a psychological problem, but an aesthetic pursuit. This is one of those cases in which a man abuses women in the name of art. Another rhetorical device that Humbert uses to connect with the reader is literary and historical allusions. Connolly states, by making passing reference to the worlds of mythology and fairy tale, and to writers from Catullus to Poe, Humbert subtly flatters those readers who recognize these allusions and who therefore can applaud themselves for their intelligence and broad literary knowledge. Humbert's allusions had no effect on me. They actually make me feel more repulsion towards him. The problem is that his use of allusions is not subtle at all, and this always makes me roll my eyes because it comes across as condescending to the readers. And again, Humbert is very condescending, so I think Nabokov knew what he was doing when he wrote the literary allusions the way that he did. The last tool of persuasion is the style of the narrative. Connolly explains, the very style of Humbert's narrative, its dazzling use of language with striking soundplay and original imagery, exerts a palpable appeal to many readers. Some of these readers may be willing to overlook the seriousness of Humbert's actions because of the brilliance and energy of his style. If you like Gothic fiction, which I know most of you do because 50% of this channel is dedicated to the Gothic genre, you already know that the most gruesome subjects can be hidden within the most beautiful prose, enchanting atmosphere, and sensuous imagery. You will not fall for this if you read the novel with a critical eye. You will see the conflict of the story buried under layers of beautiful Baroque prose. To me, the contrast between the theme and the style only make the theme more terrifying. Nabokov also makes sure that all these rhetorical devices are insufficient for the reader to side with Humbert, and he does it by setting Humbert as a non-reliable narrator. Throughout the story, Humbert is institutionalized 3 times, and he brags about how good he is at concealing he is a pedophile and at tricking his psychologist into thinking that his mental health problems are related to other things. What Nabokov implies with this is that Humbert might be also playing with his readers. He even claims that at this point in his life, he has only words to play. His victims are gone and cannot speak for themselves. So Humbert can use his words to play with us while recreating his version of the events. In the novel's most important scenes, Humbert shows how he can twist the narrative in his favor. In one scene, Humbert molests and fondles Dolores. While Humbert says that Dolores didn't even know what was happening, Nabokov describes the scene so that the readers can see that she is very aware of what is happening. In another scene, Humbert claims that his sexual encounters with Dolores begin because she seduces him. Dolores kisses him and whispers something in his ear. But Humbert does not reveal to his readers what Dolores says. He limits himself to imply that during her summer camp, Dolores and a boy were experimenting with their sexuality. Then Dolores says, "You mean you have never?" And this whole passage is full of dashes and parentheses. This is called aposiopesis, a rhetorical device that uses punctuation to convey a breaking off in thought or speech. This means that Humbert is trying to conceal something from his readers. Then Dolores says, "Here's where we start," and the scene fades to black. We don't know what Dolores is proposing to do, how far she is willing to go, and how aware she is of the consequences of her actions. Even if Humbert is telling us Dolores is consenting, she cannot consent because she's not fully aware of what she's doing. He is also doing something that many adults do when they want kids to do something in particular. Humbert challenges Dolores. He pretends he is inexperienced to make her believe she knows more than him about sex so that she can teach him. Later he says, while eager to impress me with a world of tough kids, she was not quite prepared for certain discrepancies between a kid's life and mine. Pride alone prevented her from giving up, for, in my strange predicament, I feigned supreme stupidity and had her have her way, at least while I could still bear it. As a side note, here, Humbert uses the word life as a metonymy to refer to his penis. When he says, she was not quite prepared for certain discrepancies between a kid's life and mine, this shows that Dolores did not understand the difference between having sex with a boy of her age and a man, that now she is taken aback by the difference, and that she doesn't know that Humbert is baiting her. Moreover, Connolly explains that when Humbert says, I feigned supreme stupidity and had her have her way, at least while I could still bear it, the clear implication here is that he could not bear her inexperienced maneuvers and took charge himself, turning her now into the subordinate object of his desires. Humbert also tries to lessen his actions by saying that she wasn't even a virgin, which is an argument that people still use nowadays to discredit cases of sexual assault. Virginity has nothing to do with sexual consent. Dolores cannot consent because she's 12 years old, and she doesn't have the experience to be with a man. There are many doubles throughout the narrative. The purpose of the doubles in this story is to obscure the identities of some characters and to question the narrator's veracity. For example, Humbert admits that Humbert is not his real name. The repetition of his chosen name suggests both duplicity and doubleness, which are features of his personality. He is a hypocrite who constantly projects himself on other people. Other doubles are the real Annabelle versus Annabelle Lee, Dolores and Lolita, Dolores and Annabelle, Humbert and Quilty, and Lolita and Humbert. All these doubles are creations of Humbert, to the point that we cannot tell where one character ends and the other begins. In the beginning of the story, Humbert explains that he fell in love with Dolores because she reminded him of Annabelle Lee, a girl he loved and lost when he was young. The problem is that he not only preys on Dolores, but also on other young girls. In his essay, Cherchez la femme, who really was Annabelle Lee, Thomier argues that Humbert uses wordplay to connect Dolores and Annabelle, and both come to represent Lolita. When Humbert describes Annabelle, whom he claims was his first love, he says that due to the passage of time, he can only remember her because he has a photograph in which Annabelle's face appears blurred. Similarly, Dolores' last name is Hayes, which means a state of mental obscurity and confusion. This indicates that these girls' identities are lost in Humbert's narration because Humbert is either not being honest or not seeing the events and people involved in them as they are, but as they suit him. So the stories of these women are not portrayed faithfully. Thomier explains, to say that Annabelle may exist only as an obvious reflection of Humbert's narcissism is to admit that he refuses to recognize reality, differences, other people's personalities, and wishes. There you have it. When you read this book, you have to constantly ask yourself who the real Dolores is and how the real Humbert is. because the thing is that Humbert tries to manipulate the reader in the same way he manipulates Dolores, and in the same way he manipulates all the other characters. It is almost as if he's trying to turn you into one of his victims. So this is the end of this video. I highly recommend reading this novel if you feel at ease with the themes. It's one of the most extraordinary novels I have read, so it's really worth it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on the next video. Bye!